Hello, 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 and we're live. Welcome back to the Banned Book Club. Another day, another book.
Episode 3,
I
our first
know.
actual episode about a book, a
No,
specific book.
literally. We're gonna do the book podcast, but the first two episodes are not gonna talk about any book in specificity.
No, we just had to provide context, obviously.
We gotta let the people know what we're about and what the rest of the
Yeah.
season's gonna look like. But today, the very first book that we're gonna tackle is The Book Thief. It's Book Thief by Markus Zusak. And for anyone who has read the book before, feel free to, if you have thoughts and things as we're talking about the book in this episode, please add them to the comments below. We can see your comments when the video is like posted and when the podcast is posted, we can see your comments. So definitely feel free to comment along things that you're thinking about, what pops up for you as we talk about these things or answer the questions that we'll be talking through. And for those of you that have never read this book before, don't know what we're talking about, Lily, do you want to give us a little intro?
Yeah, so the book was written in 2005 and it's based in 1939 Nazi Germany. The back of the book says, "The country is holding its breath. Death has never been busier and will become busier still." By her brother's graveside, Liesel Memminger's life is changed when she picks up a single object, partially hidden in the snow. It's the Grave Digger's Handbook, left there by accident, and it is her first act of book thievery. So begins a love affair with books and words as Liesel, with the help of her accordion-playing foster father, learns to read. Soon she is stealing books from Nazi book burnings, the mayor's wife's library, wherever there are books to be found. But these are dangerous times. When Liesel's foster family hides a Jew in their basement, Liesel's world is both opened up and closed down. In a superbly crafted writing that burns with intensity, award-winning author Michael Zusak has given one of the most enduring stories of our time. So,
So
that's the little teaser before you get into it.
beautiful, beautiful. Before we chit-chatted about choosing what book we wanted to be our first one. Had you read this book before?
Oh, yeah, yes. Many, many years ago. But I loved it. Highly recommended it to everyone. Still highly recommend it to everyone. But if you want to get into it, the very opening of the book where you figure out who the narrator is, I just thought was brilliant. So
Yeah. God, I love this book. I'm so excited. I
let's
think,
do it.
yeah, let's get into it. If you wanna take it away, let's start off with our
Yeah.
narrator.
So, spoiler, huge spoiler, but it's in the first few pages. The narrator of the book is Death,
Hmm.
and I find that fascinating. He is telling you about Liesel and her story from a book he found on Liesel. Like she had written her own memoir or journal. So Death takes this book from Liesel when she eventually dies. So he's now telling Liesel's story, sort of in her own words, but through his perspective. So you get the little caveats of, oh, yes, and this is when this character died and what it was like when I picked up their soul.
I think it's a really interesting tool to like as an author to sit there and go, you know what? Of the many narrators I could choose, instead of choosing a character, instead of choosing this, I'm gonna choose death. And this book is set in Germany, specifically Nazi Germany. And it chronicles Liesel's life in different events that happen throughout her life as death sees them. But the core of it is in Nazi Germany. So I think it's a really interesting tool to use death as a narrator, and it brings up the question of like, is death a trustworthy narrator? What are the different things that comes with bringing death in as a narrator? Like, what is death bringing that a human narrator doesn't?
Perspective,
Yeah.
like the broader sense of here's everything else that's going on in the world during this massive, massive war. And yet Death was somehow drawn to Liesel's story with everything going on around her.
And to also think about, I think it's interesting the personification of death. As a narrator, there are different moments and different quotes throughout the book that death will say that you're like, oh, like I see where that's coming from. And I see like the third person with like touch of like, this is how I experienced it, but this is what happened as I saw it. But there are little moments where death is or speaks about what it is to like be death and to constantly be the person that is, bringing people. And there's a point in the book where death mentions how people go, and it's like some people just fall out of their bodies very easily. And when I say fall out, I'm talking about their souls. Within the context of this book, whether or not you believe in souls, that's a whole different conversation. To think about like, oh, there are certain souls that just like come with me quite easily, and there are others that cling to every bit of life that they can until I have to sever that connection. And then there are the people that I just barely miss, that I should have taken at a specific time, but through somebody else's involvement or through events or because I didn't involve myself, we did not meet. So I think that that's also like an interesting bit that comes with being death as a narrator.
Hmm. And even when we're getting the recounting of Hans Huberman's like World War I
Hmm.
story, Death says, that's the first time he escaped me. And then the second time is
Yeah.
in 1943. So it is a sense of death literally comes for us all, but
Yeah.
there are times when you escape it for a little bit, but eventually it'll catch up to you.
Crazy. I think it's one of the things that really draws me to this book. Like, this is something I read in high school, I think, the very first time. And then just over the years have read it and reread it. And the book itself makes me bawl. Like, I cry like a baby every time I read it. And there is a movie adaptation for the book. Obviously, it's a bit different, as is with any adaptation from novel to book. I think the stories in there are really, really powerful and really make you think about a lot of things. I guess we can start delve in a little bit into Liesel and our main character.
Yeah. I think just before we do that, or maybe this is related, what's also so brilliant about this book and most novels, historical novels in particular, is you get that small personal glimpse
Mhm.
and that story within the broader context of these huge world events. So while we're focused on what's happening to Liesel and her family and to Max in the basement, you're so focused on hoping that they all survive
Yeah.
while getting that greater context of everything that's going on around them. And Max is hiding in the basement because he's Jewish and he's hiding from the Holocaust. So you know that those bigger things are happening outside, but so much of the story is played in just the Huberman house because that's the reality of what it was like for everyday people, was you still had to go on living your life. And so this story tells you that, and I think helps put some historical things into perspective.
Yeah. I think the fact that it's set a lot, so much of it is set in the home, and you can, even within the home, you can see the different things that are being hidden or like adjusted for the risk of any soldiers coming through and like seeing things. It made me think a lot about like Diary of Anne Frank,
Mm.
obviously hidden away behind a bookcase. And I don't know about you, but I have visited the actual like Anne Frank house, now museum. And it's a really powerful space, and you can see the spaces and where they lived, and it's a small space for such a big
Mm.
family. We can talk more about that on like when we cover that book. Tune in. But it's definitely things that makes you think a lot about the domestic if we are thinking about our own spaces and the way that we inhabit spaces. I think that's always so interesting thinking about like existing outside of the home versus in the home. And then existing during a time like this where you quite literally can't be you inside of your own of the space that you are supposed to privately inhabit as well is heartbreaking in a lot of ways.
Mm.
I think it's so interesting since we are sort of essentially following Liesel from a young age up until through the end of the book. It's also interesting the ways that the space changes as she gets older and as there are different like turning points in her life and in the war and Max, Rudy, and everything, you can see how those spaces are described differently and how those change as well. So it's almost like it's a another character that we're following along with.
Yeah, you see her get progressively more confident, but then also has to hide such a big secret. So, although as a person, like, she's moved from the kindergarten up into her right school age, and as she continues to learn to read and is so curious about the world, so much of her personal existence continues to be sequestered into the house in order to protect the secret that they have there.
Yeah, I want to bring up the point of the title, The Book Thief. The fact that the very first book that Liesel steals is the Gravedigger's Handbook is feels a little bit ironic with death as a narrator
Mm-hmm.
and everything that's coming to be like this is the thing, like this is the very first book that gives her that title but also gives us the reader the title of the book that we're reading.
Mm-hmm.
And of all books that you could put in front of her, the Gravedigger's Handbook. I don't know what did you think about that?
I loved it as a way to introduce, Liesel to
Hmm.
the narrator, since it is the first time he sees her. It's so practical. Like, of all of the books for a girl to read first, or to
Yeah,
like learn to read, it was the most practical thing that she could have found.
yeah,
As opposed to, if she had stolen a children's book from her classroom or something to that effect. Um,
yeah.
but I wondered when I first read it, is this an omen?
Oh,
I definitely had the idea, like, at some point down the road, is she going to be burying somebody else? In which, spoiler, she ends up losing several people. So
yeah.
I saw it as a little bit of an omen of there's more graves to come as well that she would need to know about.
Damn, Lily.
And it was like, I can see the future or something.
Casual. NBD. I mean, I definitely saw it very much as a space of her clinging to her past.
Hmm.
Like obviously as she's within the book thief, in this scene where she steals the first book, The Gravedigger, her brother essentially passes away. The brother can't be buried immediately, so he's buried 2 days later by a pair of gravediggers, one of them that was an apprentice, and the apprentice drops the book from his pocket as they're conducting this whole scene. And she picks it up and she continues on the journey with her mom where they eventually like separate. But to me, obviously, like reading that whole scene, I definitely saw it as a way for her to cling and hold
Hmm.
on to something tangible of like, oh, I just lost my brother and now I'm about to lose my mother as well. And like this is the last like key and like big sort of traumatic moment to be like, I'm about to lose my whole family and I don't have anything. Like I'm young. I don't have anything to connect them to. So for me, it also felt very much like a way to be like, oh, I need to cling on to this tangible thing.
Hmm.
In the same way that like young kids hold on to a teddy bear, a blankie, it felt like that kind of symbolism to it,
Hmm. Hmm.
with like the irony of it being a gravedigger's handbook and obviously, like I mentioned before, having death as our narrator,
Hmm.
checking it out. Wild. What's a scene that sticks out to you as you're going through reading the book? Is there like another turning point that you think about?
When she befriends, I don't want to say befriends, but when the mayor's wife lets her into the library, I found it super compelling because, the mayor's wife watched her steal her second book from the book burning. And rather than turn Liesel in or even give her a lecture, she said, "No, I'm just going to open my library to you instead." I saw that as the mayor's wife's way of being like, "Hey, don't read that book that was supposed to be burned because we have all of these other things that you could read. But I think, again, when I first read it, I fully expected Liesel to get into trouble in some way, just based on my knowledge of how Nazi Germany worked, and you turned in your neighbors if
Yeah.
they weren't doing the right roles. So it was nice to see that other side of like humanity from the
Yeah.
wife to come out and say, I'm just going to open my home to you a little bit. But then when you find out that a lot of the books were from her son who had passed, it adds that extra layer of Liesel's feeling a void that this
Yeah.
woman had, which of course becomes important again when Liesel moves in.
Yeah. I think it's also so interesting the like thinking about the power of stealing in this instance. Especially like I know for the mayor's wife, like the first book that she steals was a book that the mayor wife originally like offered as a gift, and she goes back and steals it.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like she's not able to accept it as a gift, but she can accept it if she's, taking it without consent.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the things that's really big here, like obviously there are different reasons why she's stealing the book and a lot of references that tie to her past and I think in general there's a lot of ties to like her brother and how she has that connection, especially like with the library then being also a sort of altar to somebody else who had passed for the mayor's wife.
Mm.
I think a lot about stealing as active protest in the book. Like you have the literal protest of stealing books that are supposed to be being burned, but then also taking books that are already existing in a library, knowing that some of these have been given to you or offered to you to be able to take. And I think that's really interesting to consider. Yeah.
I also look at it as, if you were starving, is it ethical to steal a loaf of bread? And in so many ways, books are Liesel's lifeline. So is she stealing books because, like, that's her world? Like, that's what she feeds on and she needs. And therefore, is it unethical to steal those books? I don't know. But that's the way I looked at it was, it's like her stealing a loaf of bread because she's starving. Like in some
Yeah.
ways she was starving for those words.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's it's a thing where people are in education, they're like, "Oh, you're like hungry for more and wanna you want to take in more knowledge." It's that same way of like feeding yourself. And even when you're thinking of like the house, the way that she's learning to read and the way that they're writing and that kind of emphasis in general throughout the book, the emphasis on words and the
Mm-hmm.
power of words, I think is really huge. So to be a book thief on top of being a child who's being taught that like your words are important, like these are the things that we're doing, these are the ways that we are standing up to like the horrors that are going on around us and the world that is going to hell around us, but still go through and choose to seek out this thing and I mean I definitely think it's also like a form of like a defense and coping mechanism as comes with many things like there's just so many topics here particularly like if we're just looking at Liesel, not even looking at the other characters, there's just so many things that like pop up and continue to show their face again even throughout the book, and we're only talking about like the first little bit so far. Yeah, I think it might be maybe interesting to talk about the introduction of Max
Mm-hmm.
into all of it. Should we introduce Max as a character?
Yeah. So Max is a German Jewish man whose father had served in the First World War with Liesel's foster father, Hans Huberman. And Max's dad is the one that taught Hans how to play the accordion, which is a huge thing throughout the book. And he was the one that volunteered Hans to stay behind before a battle in which his whole division or brigade or unit, ended up being killed. So Max's father basically saved Hans's life. And after the war, Hans went to see the family and apologize and offer help if they should ever need it. So when the Nazis start to persecute the Jews and deport them, Max goes into hiding and finds his way to the Huberman's home and hides there for a good bit of the book.
Yeah, before being taken away to a concentration camp. It's, I mean, I think that relationship that Liesel and Max, well, I think the relationship with Max and Hans, it's definitely very interesting. And then also the relationship between Max and Liesel, in that Hans is in a lot of ways feels indebted to Max through extension of, his father. And it's almost like he needs that to deal with the World War I part of his life, to feel like, oh, I think a big thing obviously in war, like you're dealing with a lot of survivor's guilt, and
Mhm.
especially if your whole squadron passes away, and you're the one that was sent to stay behind. And then Max and Liesel separately, there's a lot of similarities between them. Like obviously age-wise, they're very different, but they both, for one, see Hans as a space of safety, as a place of comfort. And they're both struggling with their past and things that come through their past. Obviously, with Max, it's a little bit more traumatic, a lot of bit more traumatic versus Liesel. And obviously with the age difference, there's a level of just like understanding as you get older versus when you're younger and even experiencing all this. Like if this book was set with Liesel being in her 20s versus like a child,
Mhm.
the book would be very different. It would be a very different feeling, and the understanding of how the world around us would be working. And I think also the way that she interacts with her
Mhm.
relationships would be very different. But the way that they both uphold and revere just words, thinking of like the books that Max writes for Liesel, and the ways that Liesel's always, during air raids, is always reading, is always like seeking these things out. I think it's such a big, just thorough thread in the book. Yeah. Goes on and says that Liesel's the one that gives him strength. Liesel's words give me strength and give me the power to cut down hate, to get through the day and to be able to survive being sent away to a concentration camp at a time where like words are the only thing that you really can control.
Mhm.
There's something really pure in that. I don't know if that's the right word, but for the time being, it feels like the right word. Yeah, I don't know. How did you see that relationship between the two of them?
I saw it as like a brother-sister relationship,
Hmm.
surrogacy, because I also think in some ways the relationship between Hans and Max is the surrogate father-son relationship because Hans doesn't have a good relationship with his own son.
Yeah.
So I definitely wonder, like, is this the slightly parallel universe where, Liesel would have been totally welcomed into the Huberman family by Rosa and Hans and their two kids, but instead this is her being welcomed into the family that is Rose, Hans, and then eventually Max.
The ideas of justice and
Mm.
judgment in the book. I mean, even just with starting off like being called a thief. And I think there's a lot of things that this book twists in the ways that we think about. I think in any book that's going to be set in Nazi Germany, in general, there's going to be like a complicated relationship with a lot of these like standard
Hmm.
words, phrases, things like justice, judgment, the way that we perceive different characters and all of that. But I don't know, what do you think about just like the concept of justice
Good
in
Lord.
general?
Whew.
Justice as a concept, and then we can talk about it within the book.
Oh, girl. I'm like blanking on even a definition of justice. I'm sitting and like I think I know what it means. And I'm sitting here very like social justice-y minded, where I'm like, everyone
Yeah.
deserves to have a roof over their head. Good Lord, justice within the context of the book. I don't know that you get justice in the book. In theory, if you had your happy ending, Rosa and Hans would have survived. And Liesel would have lived with them for forever, and Rudy wouldn't have died either. But the reality is, it's set during a war
Yeah.
in which millions and millions were killed. So you're not necessarily going to get that happy ending that you would maybe expect from a book set in the US where, the civilian population wasn't bombed.
Yeah.
I don't know that you can have justice in this book as far as, the characters that you've grown attached to goes, because in reality, you don't have a lot of justice when it comes to war for the
Yeah.
everyday person.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's very true. I think anything within the concept of war, there's so much that just gets even more complicated. Like, obviously, World War II happened, but what was happening in Nazi Germany was also like a massive genocide.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
So it's also thinking about it of like through the lens of both war and genocide and what it is to just try to like exist day by day.
What I think is so important then in that context is that Max is with them,
Hmm.
because it almost creates a space for readers to say, oh, these people are good people. And so you're allowed to get attached to them
Yeah.
and relate to them, because as the reader, you would hope that you would have made the same decisions to save people
Yeah.
during a genocide, as opposed to just kind of going about and letting it happen, because your
Yeah.
day-to-day life might not have changed, or in some ways might have improved, or you took advantage of, stolen property or businesses or
Yeah.
whatnot.
I mean, especially when you have like scenes in the book that it's like the prisoners of the camps being marched through town, and you can see how they're being tortured, like on their, like physically, you can see how run down they are, seeing and talking about like mandated book bans, seeing the ways that different neighbors will interact and be like, oh, like, I'm not going to say the phrase, but the phrase that you said in, as soldiers and in regards to power at that time. I don't feel comfortable saying it, so I'm never going to say it. But
The greeting?
yes,
Okay.
you know, like even little things like that where they're like briefly mentioned in the book, but they're very real things that people had to sit and contend with. And yeah, I don't know. Justice is like an interesting thing within this book because I think at the core of it, you don't get justice. And I think that's intentional because
I agree.
outside of like the setting and the message of the book, I think so often a lot of books that are around the concept that are around like the setting of World War II and are around the setting of the Holocaust are meant to be survivor stories and are meant to bring this like moment of hope, which is great, and like you need those stories as well to continue to pass on those moments and being able to hear the survivor stories to know that these things actually happened and these things were really horrific and they still continue to happen day to day in different countries. Just because it's 2025 doesn't mean that that doesn't exist in the world right now. Having a book that quite literally ends in death
Hmm.
is more true to all of that and is more true to like you should also be hurting as you're reading this because this is not supposed to be a book for enjoyment. This is
It's not a
this
beach read.
no, it's
No,
not escapism. It's supposed to make you think and it's supposed to make you contemplate.
it's a
And
lesson.
yeah, there's just so many little like mini lessons throughout the book, but at the core of it, like it's supposed to hurt.
Yeah. And at the core, it comes down to the power of words, whether or not those words were in the book or the conversations had in their house, or even just the absence of words. Like Lisa knowing she's not supposed to say anything about Max.
Yeah.
And so she's able to keep those secrets by not saying anything. but then goes down to the basement and has, conversations with Max and reads with Max.
Yeah.
Um, so at the core, it's about words and the power of words and what they can make you do and what they make you feel.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting to note the book is only spans like a handful of years. Like it's not the very beginning is pretty much already kind of in the thick of it.
Mhm.
So it's not like this is how it was before, this is how it is during, this is how it is after. It's very much all pretty much during and until it's all over.
During meaning the war.
Yeah, during the
Yeah,
war.
yeah.
So I think that's also important that it's not supposed to be a before and after
Hmm.
type of snapshot. Let me pull. Is a child who fights more forgivable than an adult who fights? Why? The eyebrows on that one.
Well, I think it's Lisa was fighting to defend herself
Mm-hmm.
and to defend Rudy in some situations. But Max was a street fighter, so he did it for sport. So I think it's different in both cases. And Max's feels more on the adult end
Mm-hmm.
of it because it's a sport to him. And, even today you have boxing and MMA and WWE and all of those things that I don't even know if those are the right letters. Is it more acceptable for a child to fight than an adult? No. I mean, I'd personally say it's probably best that nobody fights. But when it comes to fighting to defend somebody
Yeah.
or to defend yourself, like those are justified and often necessary. Whereas picking a fight in a bar because you had one too many or because you just like want to pick on somebody smaller than you, then
Yeah.
that's not okay by any means at any age.
Yeah. I will say, as someone who works with young children, they literally have no concept of their own bodies, let alone of their bodies with other people. Like today, I had my one of my youngest classes, which is like 3 to 5 year olds, and one of my kids, like he cutest little thing. However, he has no concept of how rough he can be when he's playing. And it's like he's just trying to play, but it comes across as like fighting or like comes across as aggressive. And like obviously I'm using the example of a 3 year old versus, 20 something year old. If it's more forgivable for a child to fight than an adult, it's because children to a certain extent are viewed as being and having this innocence and like not really understanding why they're fighting or seen as like, oh, you're just like dealing with a lot of big emotions and, when you get older, you'll know better. Versus when you're an adult, it's almost like, oh, well, you know better. Like, why are you doing that? Whether or not it's like fighting for a good reason, fighting for a good cause, fighting to defend yourself. It's almost because of that sense of when you're an adult, you're no longer considered naive. You're not considered innocent. You're seen as like, all right, the real world is out there and you are in it, so behave accordingly. Versus a kid, you're like, you have no idea what the world has in store for you. Just don't do that and we'll be okay. So I think I don't know that it's necessarily more forgivable, but I think societally speaking, it's just not taken seriously. In the same way that like there's just so many examples I could use in the real world of like ways that children have said things or made threats and they're not taken seriously and then something happens and then you're like, well, why didn't anyone, who noticed this say anything? Why didn't no one make a note about this?
Hmm.
And I think it's also the added factor of in general, and I'm going to say definitely more so with men than with women, the way that fighting is talked about and discussed is very different. And it definitely ties into existing in patriarchal societies and existing in spaces where being quote unquote a man and fighting and is seen as a manly thing. I think there's also that added like connotation to it. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Hmm.
Everyone be nice to each other. If you're listening with a friend, turn to them, give them a hug, give them a high five, spread kindness.
Treat people with kindness. Big,
Yeah.
big to do in 2025.
Yeah. Is there any other big things that we want to talk about within the book? Or should we maybe talk a little bit about why we chose the book?
We'll go into why.
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
Sure. So the book thief isn't necessarily on any banned book lists, and it's not super controversial, but we wanted to start out with a book that demonstrates the dangers that come with book bans or the ways in which you can get a society to do book burnings.
Yeah.
So we wanted to just illustrate this is what could happen. Not that it will, don't fearmonger. But just to get the context of what a society looks like when you are limiting and censoring books and knowledge and what that can eventually lead to.
Yeah. I think for one, for me, The Book Thief is one of my treasured books in my own personal library. It's a book that I have always held near and dear to my heart. There were many years where it was my favorite book. It is this year not my favorite book, but it's definitely a book that I return to at different stages of my life. I think it's very important. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, the book makes me bawl. The movie makes me bawl. Like I cry like a baby every time I read it. Maybe that's just me, but and I think it's interesting to be a banned book podcast that it is focusing on these concepts of censorship within books. I think it's interesting for us to start with a book like The Book Thief, which is not only talking about the bans, like Lily mentioned, but also talking about like the power of words and the power of knowledge, which I think is so important. And The Book Thief has never been formally, or as far as we've been able to research it, has never been formally banned. It has been challenged in occasions where it's been brought up in conversations to be introduced to curriculum. But as a book, in terms of like existing in a library, existing in those spaces, it has not been challenged to that same degree. And in general, when we're talking about book challenges, particularly in schools, it's a lot of parents for the most part, sometimes educators, who are challenging for specific reasons. So, for example, The Book Thief, the reasons why this book has been challenged has been for its dark content, vulgar language, and perceived racism. I think it's important to note the use of the phrase perceived racism instead of actual racism, because when you're looking at the book, and for anyone who's read the book, you would know this already. The book is set in a fictional city, but it includes actual elements, which are racism, strong gender roles, air raids, attacks on Jews, mentions of things like concentration camps. There's also obviously strong moments of anti-Semitism. And when we say anti-Semitism, we are specifically talking about against Jewish populations. We're not talking about the complexities of the phrases it's used in today's 2025 context. Anti-Semitism as it's,
In its historic context.
in its historic context versus its current modern day
Okay.
iterations, redefinitions of all that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Just I feel like it's important to add that little caveat because
Okay.
but yeah, so that's why it's been challenged. Oh, and then being like just explicit, quote unquote. So it's in and when you're looking at book bans, it's a lot of these same things. But I think it's interesting noting the perceived racism because it's like who decides what is and isn't racism when you're challenging something as opposed to just saying racism, which is obviously a big topic of conversation in general. But yeah, this is the first book that we chose, not formally banned, at least as of January 30th, 2025. Not been banned anywhere, but definitely challenged. Yeah.
So, just to give a little bit more context about the types of books that were banned and that Liesel would have attempted to save from the fire, the non-exhaustive list of types of books that were banned in Nazi Germany include, quote, the works of traitors, immigrants, and authors from foreign countries who believe they can attack and denigrate the new Germany, end quote, the literature of Marxism, communism, and Bolshevism, pacifist literature with liberal democratic tendencies and attitudes, all historical writings whose purpose is to denigrate the origin, the spirit, and culture of the German folk, or to dissolve the racial and structural order of the folk, or that denies the force and importance of leading historical figures in favor of egalitarianism and the masses, and which seeks to drag them through the mud. Books that advocate, quote, art, which is decadent, bloodless or purely constructivist, writings on sexuality and sexual education, which serve the egocentric pleasure of the individual and thus completely destroy the principle of race, literature by Jewish authors, regardless of the field, popular entertainment literature that depicts life and life's goals in a superficial, unrealistic, and sickly sweet manner, and all books degrading German purity. So, any of that sound a little familiar? Um, because that's a lot of the book bans we're seeing today are moving forward. Books that are being questioned come down to questioning America's history or are unpatriotic, or a lot of books that have queer or LGBTQ characters are being challenged or outright banned. And that's all very reminiscent of previous book bans.
Silence is loud for that one. It's like so tough to be existing in a space where you're seeing like the duality and like the parallels of that, which is just scary.
History does not repeat, but it echoes.
Yeah.
One of my favorite sayings, which will probably come up a million times on this podcast.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And obviously, like as we go through the podcast, and continue on through the rest of the season, not every book is going to be as heavy as the very first one that we chose. Obviously, some of the books on this banned book list can be much quote unquote lighter themes, but in general, we'll talk about what each of them is going through. And like I mentioned at the beginning, you guys can comment any opinions, thoughts. If there are books that you want us to cover and chat about, feel free to include those in your comments. We can definitely take a look, see if we can cover any of those. But I think that might be it for tonight or today. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't read The Book Thief, definitely go read it. You can find it at your local bookstore, library, audiobook, ebook. Definitely recommend to go check it out. And yeah,
Thanks for reading with us.
that's so cute. Oh my God. All right. See you folks on the next one.